What's up, my Beardos and Weirdos? One topic here, and we're diving right back into r/NuclearRevenge. Now we're going to be taking a look at one story today. This one has been cross-posted over from r/ProRevenge, but as many people suggested, it might better live in Nuclear Revenge. So, let's get started. My mother destroyed my childhood, made me fail out of college, and laughed when I was homeless. I destroyed her entire fusing life. Final update. You can find my prior posts here and here. I'd also like to thank Slazo, aka MK, on YouTube for sharing a GoFundMe I forgot about and sharing my story in one of his videos. You were really kind. Also, I'd like to thank Ambrosia for sending me their old Nikon camera that still works like a charm. I appreciate your kindness. I still don't feel like I deserve it at times. After almost 25 years of violent abuse by my mother, I finally got the kind of revenge I've always dreamed about as a kid, going through the worst of it, but it didn't make me feel the way I expected. TLDR at the bottom. I'm sorry this post is so long. Reddit is the only place I ever really write or talk about my life in detail. I'm also really sorry to all the people who suggested I take the high road. I didn't. You were all right. It didn't make me feel better. I know the deliberate steps I took to purposely ruin my mother's life makes me a bad person. I'm willing to accept that, and I'm going to continue trying to become the person I believe I can be. I'm not sorry. You can skip to the end if you don't want a rehash of my subpar life and would rather read the update. Lastly, if my sister ever reads this, I'm sorry I wasn't a better brother. Rehash. For those who aren't aware of my life, I'll try to summarize it all, but it's not something that's easily put into a short paragraph or two. Growing up with my mother was worse than hell. If you've ever wondered what it would be like if your worst enemy went back in time to raise you, you'd understand my life. At some point around 9 or 10, I began to realize how alone I was and how exhausting my life would turn out to be. I kept hoping, this time, she'd finally just continue wailing on me, hoping she'd just never stop beating me and finish the job. Either that or I'd be so close to death she'd be forced to take me to the hospital where they would question her and I'd somehow be saved. It seemed like nobody ever cared enough to look deeper. Dislocated my shoulder with a cast iron pipe, beating me every night until I ate things I was slightly allergic to, and then beating me up more for throwing it up. Lit my Christmas presents I got, then having to be held back by her boyfriend at the time because she was holding a knife to my neck, telling me for the millionth time that I was worth less than my father. And nobody else would care if she did it. I could fill pages with all the things she did to me. I remember when she really started digging in and telling me I was worthless nearly every day. I was 13, and it was the first time I started contemplating suicide, though I was always too weak to follow through. My mother tried to kill me 3 or 4 times, if you count a half-ashed poisoning. I say half-ashed only because I vaguely remember the details, but it involved her forcing me to drink something with bleach in it. It's kind of funny in a sick way, because I didn't even remember that until now, and that's not as bad as all the things I've put a lot of effort into not remembering. I just have shizzy memory, so I guess it helps. I don't think I've actually went longer than a few weeks without getting beaten or bloody over something trivial like not washing dishes fast enough or walking away too hard after just getting beat up by her. Years of physical and psychological attacks. Did I call the cops? Of course I did. Can you imagine how hard it was to watch my mother smile and lie to the cops, telling them I was exaggerating, then having to watch them get into their cars and drive away knowing I had to go back inside? In the beginning, I had hoped things would change. Towards my teen years, I started drinking and stopped caring. And now, here I am, after all of it, somehow still alive. My stepdad used to tell me years after his divorce with my mother that he only stayed with her because he was afraid she'd kill me one day. He's lucky he never saw how much worse it got when he wasn't there to take the hits for me anymore. It would break his heart. He was also the one who told me about my mother's being abused while growing up in a different country, which helped me to gain some perspective in my teens. It didn't matter to me, because each and every day she had a choice every time, and she'd choose to hurt me every time. Maybe I'm overstating things, considering she didn't actually kill me even though she had come close so many times. Maybe that means deep down she secretly cared about me or something? I don't know. I don't think about it. She did go out of her way to buy me new electronics often, but she'd end up using those as leverage against me and invading my privacy constantly, so it ultimately wasn't that much of anything. After everything, and all the time she kicked me out from 13 to 17 years old, I was always on edge. She told me when I was 18 while I was staying with my aunt that if I went to college, I'd always have a place to live. I don't know why I believed her. I had went to go stay with my aunt temporarily for 4 to 6 months after my mother kicked me out of the house at 17, but my mother would always stop by and buy groceries for me or leave me cash. She was unnaturally kind to me while I was there. By this point, she wasn't hitting me anymore. Not that she could, as I'd have snapped and absolutely wrecked her shiz at that age, but I strongly dislike hurting people in any form, so the point is moot. And more so, prone to just verbal attacks, but since I was never really around her anymore, life seemed to get easier. My mother had learned more than enough ways to fuse with me without touching me. It seemed like she hated me more than I hated myself at times. My aunt couldn't have me stay with her anymore as she really liked her privacy. I had already been there for a while, and I was emotionally damaged and rebellious teenager. She didn't have time to help. So I went back to my mother's house for the last time and started attending community college full-time. I didn't really have any desire or passion. I was just an empty husk going through the motions. But I was still trying my best to keep living, even when I didn't feel the will, in the hopes that one day I'd be feeling something different for once. My mother, of course, decided to go back to her old habits. Things like dumping all the trash with dirty diapers and old food, or old dirty dishes filled with water onto my when I was out if I forgot to do them, and sometimes just because she was in a mood. Locking me out in the snow for hours because I didn't respond to a text or something, even if I had class in a few hours. I wasn't even allowed to have keys. She pretended to not hear me when I rang the doorbell or knocked for hours. She'd also tell my younger sister to ignore it. I'd eventually end up having to sleep on the steps outside or at a friend's house and get punished for doing it, even though I was 18, because it was her house and her rules. It was always nonstop. I had no real direction, and I honestly had no plans to exist past 25 years old. Despite literally all of that and then some, I was doing well in school, community college, with a 3.6-ish GPA. I finally left my mother's house for the last time a few days before finals week. I came home from drinking with friends and was met with my mother glaring at me when I rang the bell. At 9 p.m., yelling when I'd move out as soon as I walked in. She followed me to my little closet of a bedroom where I tried to close the door behind me and she half ripped the door off the hinges. I just sat there on my bed and stared at her silently as she kept cursing and screaming questions at me. My mother then walks away as I'm in the kitchen getting juice. I hear her on the phone calling the cops on me, claiming she was scared I'd murder her or my younger siblings. I just didn't have the energy to deal. This was 3 days before I failed all of my finals because I couldn't even make it. I was dealing with too much. So I went and grabbed whatever I had and left 15 minutes later. My mother and I only ever really communicated via email after, though. It was very rarely and it was very businesslike. I'd tell her what I needed and she'd either tell me to fuse off or give it to me. It was hard to maintain consistency in my life then. I was at rock bottom all the time. I didn't care about anything. I drank every day, hung out with the worst kind of people who brought out the worst in me. I bounced between cheap rooms and couches. It was early 2016 when I discovered photography, and it completely changed the direction of my life. I didn't hang out with anyone or bother trying to maintain all the pointless relationships. I just dove headfirst into it. I was able to put things I didn't understand about my life into perspective. For the first time in my life, I felt something. Not like a feeling, per se, just like the sense of possibility. For the first time, I was seriously wondering just what I could be capable of. I had something to look forward to. I felt like if I pushed myself as hard as possible, I'd be good at something. And I'd be a good person. And so I isolated myself from nearly everyone I knew and spent every single day learning or practicing or being frustrated that it wasn't getting results. Even though I was drinking heavily, I always held a job and kept doing photo shoots and kept practicing like mad. I eventually got my first apartment and was functional for a year. Did I have my shiz together? Hell no. But I was figuring my shiz out. Cue one of the worst days of my life. Me getting robbed while I was blacked out drunk for 2 months, rent and camera gear by a friend, which led me to losing my apartment and job. Followed by an email by my mother asking how I'd been. We ended up talking on the phone and it was like civil war for 3 minutes before I mentioned how hard things had been for me. She was bragging about some new expensive speaker she bought, and I, like a dumbass, asked her for money, about $100. I told her if I could give my landlord anything, he'd be reasonable and give me time to get more cash together, and I'd be fine. Lol, that obviously did not go well at all. It all escalates to her literally laughing, and then telling me it was my own fault for being homeless. She also completely denied ever abusing me when I stated I was in this situation because of her. I hung up on her. My thoughts were all over the place, and I felt this intense frustration, more so than anger. Within a few moments, my head cleared, and I had decided something as I was sitting in my bedroom 5 or so minutes after the call. I decided I was going to completely ruin my mother's fusing life, no matter what. Revenge. And so I did. I called CPS on her and informed them of my history of abuse at her hands. I informed her about the dozens upon dozens of old photos I have of myself all bloody and bruised up. I previously compiled as much evidence as possible in my teens, though never did anything with it until that point. That sparked a visit, which led to an emergency removal of my 3 younger siblings when they caught my mother, punishing my little sister, coincidentally, when they happened to do a visit. My mother was also arrested, but released hours later. I reached out to the job she got a few years ago with the fake resume she made me write for her, and made them aware of her falsehoods. Because of her field, it was promptly looked into, and she was fired as well as blacklisted. She lost a nearly $80,000 salary. I then deleted every email in all of the email accounts I made for her because she never changed the passwords. Afterwards, I deleted the email accounts themselves. Within a few weeks, things were definitely going downhill for her. My youngest sister's dad was engaged to my mother and is now trying to file for sole custody of my little sister, who's in CPS custody. I'm sure he wasn't happy finding out what his baby daughter has in store if my mother was given free rein. She's missed her court appointments, and I know she hasn't been able to pay her mortgage since last year, as I've heard she had to ask one of her friends for money. Her life had become a creamy, messy shiz symphony, and I was the fecal-splattered conductor. It was all going to shiz. She went radio silent for a few months and had a warrant after missing another court date. This was all fall, winter of last year that she was off the grid, so I went on with my life. Early 2019, I get a random call from her and find out she went to her home country months ago after everything went to shiz. How she was allowed on a plane? I have no clue. So cue another geyser of bullshit spewing from my mother's mouth. She's telling me I need to tell CPS she's a good mom and that she's never abused them or me. It's unbelievable. So I cut her off and I shut her up. I was a little buzzed when she had called, and had always mentally prepared for that moment. I started slowly telling her in graphic detail about all the gross shiz I used to do to her food because fuse it. I told her about how I used to pee in the pitcher of Lipton iced tea she used to force me to make for her, and then not allow me to have. I told her how I secretly sabotage her utensils with my butt cheeks before serving her food. She was quiet at first, but then began cursing me out, though it didn't bother me. I'm on a roll, and I wasn't listening. Her words didn't matter to me anymore. She's blaming me for her life turning out so terribly while fully unaware of how true that statement is in terms of the situation she was currently in. She shuts up long enough for me to get one word in before hanging up and blocking her number. I thought that was the end of it. I expected my last post to be the final update, as I've said before. My life is a shiz symphony. The official update. My aunt and I recently reconnected about 2 months ago, prior to last month. I haven't seen her in years. We met up and had a long conversation about life and everything, and then she admitted that she talks to my mother nearly every day. She had mentioned all the things happening to my mother, but didn't know it was me that started this all. She actually felt really bad for my mother, but my aunt was always a really caring person, so I understand, I guess. I told her I was very uncomfortable with the thought of her talking to me about my mother, and asked her not to. My aunt did it anyways. After meeting up with my aunt, I learned through her that my mother was finally coming back to America. She was arriving at the airport in 1 week. The problem was my aunt told her that I was going with her, so the 3 of us could all talk without telling me. I didn't know what the feeling of betrayal really felt like until my aunt told me that. To be honest, as wrong as it sounds, I'd rather my mother just think I died or something, our phone call. But my aunt kept insisting that I had to give my mother another chance, and I had to learn to be open-minded, and that she wasn't there all the times my mom did horrible shiz to me. She loved us both, and wanted us to get along. Like I'm supposed to get along with someone who has tried to murder me? Like my mother has choked me awake for school. If you don't know what it's like to forcefully wake up not being able to breathe and seeing your own mother standing over you at 5 a.m. and tightly gripping your throat, count yourself lucky. But as I said at the beginning of this post, I've already resolved myself to being a bad person, so I lied to one of the only people who was kind to me, and I promised my aunt I'd try to have a heart-to-heart with my mom and her and talk out the nearly 20 years of abuse. Obviously that was not happening. When we got off the phone, I called the detectives who gave me their number months back in case I heard from my mother. I asked them a few leading questions about what would happen if so-and-so were discovered, and then I made my plan. I wasn't sure if my mother would make it past customs. How is she able to travel to a different country with a warrant? I didn't know. But if she did, I'd call the police in the bathroom and wait for them to arrive while I sat. Cue my mother making it past fusing customs because she's my mother. She's a horrible person, but she's good at what she does, which is being horrible. I digress. My mother calls my aunt when she's getting off the planes, and my aunt says she's going to meet her. I told my aunt I'd wait for them in the little Starbucks and we'd all drive somewhere else. My aunt agreed and went off. I called the detective and told him that my mother was standing a few feet away from me, and if they could meet me at our destination we were going to. They told me that was unnecessary, and they'd have officers closer to me come and apprehend her at the airport instead. And so I waited, and waited. And then I finally saw them arriving both at the same time. The 3 to 4 officers who had convened in those few passing minutes, and actively searching around the food court I sat close to. My mother and my aunt walking down the gate towards me. I felt this overwhelming weight in my chest, just kind of settling down, deeper and deeper into my gut, the closer and closer they got, and the more the officers searched. What if they stopped looking when my mother arrived? What if my mother somehow got away with all this shiz again? Countless thoughts, but I just bit them back. I've grown very talented at silencing whatever my inner turmoil of the day happened to be, but my mother and my aunt were animatedly talking as they made their way to where I was sitting. Before they had a chance to say anything, I quickly jumped up and said, "I ordered some teas. Let me go see if they're ready," which was the first thing I could think of as they were sitting, but it worked, and I dashed off past the cash register to the Starbucks and to the outer part of the food court. Looking back, saying I had to grab some tea probably wasn't the best thing to say, but I digress. I made it a few feet out of the door and half jogged over to the officers who were still looking around the food court area. They wouldn't have seen us sitting. I walked over and asked them if they had gotten a call about a woman who had a warrant or something. I mentioned that the detectives said the officers in or near the airport would arrest her. They said they did, and I told them it was my mother. I told them her first name and they verified her last name. I told them she was sitting right in the Starbucks waiting for jail, and one of the cops chuckled. Seemed a bit surprised and judgy that I was pointing them right to my mom. I told them I'd go and make sure she didn't leave, and they followed behind me like 10 to 15 paces. I half jogged back inside, and up to the little table where they were sitting. My mother had that half scowl she always wore whenever she looked up at me when I popped up out of nowhere, and my aunt began asking me where the drinks were, before I cut her off and looked dead at my mother, and her scowling face which had quickly changed into confusion when I had finished my sentence. "Mom, I know we don't get along, but I wanted to let you know it's all my fault." Cue my mother starting to ask me with this kind of soft motherly voice, "What do you mean it's your fault? Why do you think?" But of course I cut her off because there's nothing she hates more than being cut off, and I finally have the power in this situation. "Look, Becha, I want you to know exactly whose fault it is, and whose pee you fusing drank when you're sitting in jail, wondering why in the world you did so wrong." She sputtered something and slapped the fusing shiz out of me. My aunt's jaw dropped. People are watching. The cops saw it happen as well, as only a few seconds had passed from when I walked in. Into handcuffs she goes. Now she's showing her true colors, cursing and saying all kinds of things you couldn't imagine a mom saying to her kid, telling me she'd fusing kill me, and so on, etc. I calmly walked behind them as long as I could until they took her to some room. I wasn't there that long though, as the lack of thrill of it all kind of got to me, and I went home to break a 2-month sober streak. I was there long enough for my aunt to tell me she was disappointed in me, and that she doesn't know if she can forgive me for doing something so spiteful and disgusting to her sister. To be fair, I did it completely out of spite, so she isn't wrong. I've already acknowledged I'm not a good person for what I did. Come to find out, my mother was using my aunt's passport to leave and come back to the country multiple times since she left. That's why they never caught her. Now my aunt has some explaining to do, but I wish she didn't have to get caught up in all this. She has always been kind to me and doesn't deserve it. My mother is facing up to 10 years just for using my aunt's passport alone, and a slew of other charges, including one for child endangerment. Her husband left her. Her kids were taken from her. Her friends have seemingly distanced themselves from her from what I know. After 19 years of abuse, I finally got my revenge, and none of the charges have anything to do with me, which is interesting. Did it feel good? No. I felt nothing. Just the rise and fall of the situation, but nothing concrete. I expected to feel something. Not even satisfaction or happiness, but something. Either way, The only thing for me to do is to continue to work towards becoming the person I want to be. She told me constantly that I was worthless and that I'm nothing. I've told myself the same consistently as well in the past. I've decided I'm going to become one of the greatest photographers of my time, and I'm going to push myself as hard as possible to succeed so that anyone else who has ever suffered how I have now have no reason to doubt themselves or their ability to be great one day. As for me right now, I currently live in a homeless shelter. I decided to go to one 6 months ago after realizing all the drinking and inconsistency was making it hard for me to move forward. I wasn't saving my money and was couch hopping from friend's house to friend's house. A few weeks ago I got a voucher from the government, and sometime in the next 2 months I can find a 1-bedroom or a studio apartment. I've been aggressively saving my small checks. I've been practicing and working on building better habits and just being a better photographer. I don't make much right now, and I know many people will say it's a stupid dream, but if I put all of effort into making this work, I can not only be a self-sustaining photographer, but more than that. My situation is embarrassing and it's hard, but I know I won't be here longer than another few months. It's not some dream, it's a plan. I'll also be going back to school in the fall and pursuing photography. As for my siblings, that situation is still a bit dicey, and I don't think I'll give an update about that, but they're all doing very well. As far as my mother is concerned, as horrible as she was towards me, the only part of me that thinks about her on rare occasions hopes she isn't having a horrible time. I don't like knowing people are hurting. TLDR, my mother physically and psychologically abused me for most of my life. After she laughed at me about being homeless, I got her fired, divorced, and months later put in jail where she's facing 10 years minimum. Also, my life is trash, but I'm trying my best. Edit, for anyone roasting my aunt, please stop roasting my aunt. She has always been supportive of me and what I do and my photography, and has always believed in me from day one. Maybe I'll take it over to r/relationships or something. I need advice, but I don't plan on putting much thought into that relationship right now. Also, for everyone asking in literally all my posts, yes, my username is on purpose. It relates to the first ever bit of revenge I was able to get at my mother. I'm sure you already know what that is. And also, thank you to everyone for being so supportive and offering me advice about places to get therapy in my inbox, but as I've said in my prior posts, I don't think therapy will help. I don't see how talking about my feelings or lack thereof is going to change anything. I'd rather just post another mini autobiography on the internet if that's cool with y'all. Thanks. Lastly, thank you to all of the kind humans and all your kind words of hope and encouragement. It means a lot to have you guys believe in me and see my value in my photography. I don't really know how to sell prints to everyone asking, but I appreciate the love regardless. Your words help me reaffirm my belief that I can get better and be great one day. I plan on it. Hope you stick around for the journey. I don't know if the mods will murder me for putting my photography page, but it's at I am Larry Potter. OP, what an incredibly lengthy story. I'm sorry that you had to survive all of that in your life, but I'm glad that you're feeling strong enough now that you can share that story, that you're willing to share your life with strangers around you. As you said, you were being closed off for quite a while, that you shut yourself off from people and that you were trying to keep your distance, but now it sounds like you are opening up a bit, and I'm really glad to see that. Now, I hope you can find some solace in your success one day. I hope you can recover things with your aunt, and I hope that things will get better with your siblings. But until then, more than happy to give you a shout out. I am Larry Potter. Let's take a look at some of your photography. Thanks for sharing that story, OP. And I hope we just see some powerful recovery in your future. Alright, my Beardos and Weirdos, that was r/NuclearRevenge, a story cross-posted from ProRevenge. A long one, but worth the read. Thanks to everyone who's been checking out the channel lately, and thank you to everyone who's been subscribing lately. I've been hearing from all sorts of new people. I normally get comments from some of the regular folks, and I'm really glad to hear from you. And I'm just starting to get some new commenters, so hey to everyone who's been commenting lately. I appreciate that. We have had some suggestions for video types in the future, so I will be getting to those as well. This one was sent over to me by a friend, so I was happy to get this story recorded. Alright, my Beardos and Weirdos, we'll see you in the next one, where we take it one topic at a time.